It doesn't have to be.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the FemiNinja Project. And today's episode is an episode that every single parent needs to listen to. Take notes. It's very important. It's a story that I kind of wish I didn't have to share. Spoiler alert, it does have a good outcome and a happy ending. But it's an incredible story. And like I said, please share this with every single parent that you know. So our guest is Lizbeth Meredith. She is a writer, speaker, online teacher, and coach. Her award-winning and Amazon best-selling book is a memoir titled Pieces of Me: Rescuing My Kidnapped Daughters. Okay, that gave me chills. Every time I see that, I get chills. I couldn't imagine. But that book is now a Lifetime television movie. So it's reaching an awful lot of people, which is terrific. So Lizbeth is also the host of a podcast called The Persistence You with Lizbeth, which includes stories by and for survivors and strivers, all intertwined with a dose of persistence. Lizbeth, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Cheryl, it is such a pleasure to see you again. And thank you for being my honored guest on Persistence You with Lizbeth. That was so much fun. And you were such a trooper. Technical difficulties we had that day. Thank you for everything.
Oh, no, thank you. And yeah, it was really funny because I was sitting here all by myself and I didn't even realize that you were asking questions in the chat. So I did that entire episode based on that one question that had a couple of sub questions underneath it. And I thought, I have no idea how this is going to turn out, but it turned out pretty well.
You did a great job. It is such a nightmare when you're doing a podcast and there are technical difficulties. So for the listeners, like that day, I couldn't get your sound. Like I could not, or maybe it was you couldn't get mine. I can't remember which it was, but I started then just writing the questions and you did such a great job of just carrying on and interviewing yourself. It was fabulous.
And that's basically what I was doing. I was interviewing myself. And it was such a trip because if you only knew what was going through my mind as the words were coming out seamlessly. And I do remember that you asked me in that first question to please leave pauses. So I would answer a question, the phantom question, and then I would leave this long pause going, oh God, where do I go from here? So anybody out there, if you're thinking of starting a podcast, it really is a learning experience. And it's really a lot of fun. And some of the dumbest things happen when you're trying to do a show, but you get through it.
It's so true. And you just when you think you have it down, something changes.
I know, just when I think nothing else could go wrong, it's like, shut up, Cheryl, because it can. And one of these days I'll share the story about how I had to show up in my bathrobe. It was one of those things that it was, no makeup, hair in a ponytail, bathrobe. Fortunately, there was no video. However, my guest was going to be interviewing me the following day, and hers was a Facebook Live. So let me tell you, I made darn sure I was ready like 3 hours in advance. But when you're talking, when you're in the middle of the United States, you're talking to somebody from Germany, I didn't have the time change. Correct?
Right, exactly. I love it.
So anyway, you can talk about how you started the podcast and why, because I know we want to hear about that. But tell us your story. I didn't... just the title of your book should be enough to give the audience a clue of what happened. But once again, if you're a parent, perk up, listen to this. It's very important.
Right. And it's interesting, Cheryl, because why I started the podcast, how I started the podcast is related to the whole book experience too, because back in 1994, I was a single parent by 4 years. I was in my later 20s. I had 2 beautiful little daughters, and I had left my former husband after he strangled me in front of my oldest child. And spoiler alert, this is can be triggering. So I hope that that isn't too scary for your audience, but you did say it was going to be a little bit grim. But yeah, my daughter was 2. I didn't think I was going to live through that day. It was March 5th of 1990. And that was my moment of clarity where I realized I may not live through this, but if I do, something's got to change and it's got to be with me, or my kids will grow up thinking this is normal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess what I thought back in March 5th of 1990 was that the answer to abusive relationships ending is for the victim, in a sense, to make better choices. That's what I thought. I thought, well, if I just would make better choices, then, life could unfold differently and I'll just put this behind me. I felt like I had more control than I learned that I did. And what I didn't realize as a young parent, because at that point I was just in my mid 20s, was that often leaving an abusive relationship is the very thing that triggers the worst abuse yet. And more particularly women and sometimes men are killed just before or just after
Oh.
leaving a violent relationship. And so I kept moving along and trying to get stronger and smarter and be worthy of parenting the amazing little girls that I had. And it was 4 long years of me trying, getting off public assistance, getting out of the battered women's shelter,
Oh.
getting a degree in journalism. And our lives really took some fun shape, but the abuse escalated. And a lot of times our daughters were targeted because he knew that that was what would hurt me more than anything. And so fast forward 4 years, my former husband, we just finished a time where he had supervised visits because the behaviors were so detrimental to our little girls during visitation. So supervised visits are a wonderful tool to keep kids safe, and yet they can't go on forever. That's not practical.
Mm,
So the court had ended them, and one day I went to pick up our daughters at the daycare from where he would have dropped them off. So, his time with them would have ended, but they weren't there. And they weren't in the state of Alaska where we lived, and they weren't in the country.
oh.
But this is where the podcast piece comes. In 1994, when this happened, and this was also in March being a big month for me, but uh, back then it was pre-internet for the common person, and it was a time where, especially in Alaska, we were such a charming community then.
Mhm.
But people really would stand up for one another and become like a pseudo family
Mhm.
to each other when something went wrong. When you live in a state like Alaska, you're dealing with isolation geographically, harsh environment,
Mhm.
darkness, difficult elements, and people really knew that we needed intuitively one another to get by.
Mhm.
So before the internet, when all of this was going on, you can't imagine the beautiful response of people who had no investment in us.
Mhm.
We're talking about strangers, we're talking about coworkers of mine who were amazing. At that point, I worked at the domestic violence shelter that I had stayed at. So I was working a wonderful job with survivors and doing a lot of community education and loving my life in a lot of ways. It was making almost $0, but I had great community and wonderful surroundings. And people just rolled up their sleeves and said, what can we do? If
Mhm.
this happened today, I'm afraid that someone would say, why don't you throw up a good GoFundMe or
Mhm.
put it on Facebook and I'll share it and I'll ask my friends to share it. And while that has some value, there's
Mhm.
nothing like building real community.
Mhm.
And so what I would learn over the next 2 years that I didn't see my daughters, that I didn't ever hear from them,
Oh.
that I didn't know if they were safe or not, was that people from across the globe would join this grassroots effort to reunite me with my children. And my children who were experiencing the message that I had gotten was, if I can't have you, no one else will. Now they were living out my reality. They were being the ultimate target because I had chosen to leave. And so it was a devastating time. I won't go into great detail, but it ended at one point with me getting arrested in Greece. Um, a series of court hearings, so many awful things to be reunited with my now non-English speaking daughters.
Oh.
And who were too terrified to be able to really speak up as to what was going on, and who frankly had a lot of resentment and misgivings about me because I'd failed to protect them. And they just spent the last 2 years hearing how horrible I was.
Wow.
They were 4 and 6 years old when they left. 2 years plus had passed. And now we reunited again in March, because that's the emotional month for me. Just over 2 years after they were kidnapped. If it weren't for the help of strangers and coworkers and friends and people who didn't know me and some who did and all of that, this miracle would have never occurred.
Oh.
And when the pandemic happened, I realized, it's not just the pandemic, as I watched our country be ravaged by, frankly, things sometimes of our own making. We now have the internet. We hop on sometimes to say ugly things and then hop off. And we don't have the empathy that we used to have when we talked face to face. And we get politically aligned where we feel like it's okay to unfollow or unfriend people we love. And it's okay to spout off and then sign off. It's so pitiful and so painful to watch. And I thought, no, we need to remember that we are still, even if we're living in isolation due to the pandemic, we're still capable of being a community. And we can respect each other and learn more about each other and grow from knowing one another and expanding what's the most important thing, which is that human connection. So they're very much intertwined. And of course, like you said, the happy news is in March of 1996, I reunited with my children. In May, through various means that weren't the ones I intended, we did get home through leaving Greece through Turkey and then through the United Kingdom and coming home. And that's not all covered in the movie because a movie has to be 90 minutes. But then we started rebuilding our lives. And I'm happy to say that my daughters are in their 30s today. They have bucked certain intergenerational patterns. They're not in long-term abusive relationships. They're in long-term relationships without that. And they're also, both college educated and didn't get married and have early children like was the tradition in my family. And they have a future ahead of them. And they have lots of collateral damage from what happened. It's not like, oh, happily ever after.
Right.
They're fine. Not at all. I won't lie about that. And that's a big part of my memoir, was not pretending that things magically just suddenly improve with a little bit of therapy. But on the other hand, there's so much hope and so much potential.
I'm really curious, did anything happen with your ex? I mean, did he ever have to, was he arrested? Did he have to serve time? Were there any consequences?
He was arrested at one point very quickly in Greece and never went to jail, quickly was out and about. And then he remarried years after the abduction and had another little girl. And that relationship eventually went sideways as well. However, she is just adorable and is in contact with her sisters who still live in Alaska via social media. So while I have said the things that can be, if we choose to allow it, harmful using social media, there are other wonderful things like the connections that we can create. And I love that my daughters have a sister in Greece.
Oh, that's just wonderful. Is he still alive? I'm just wondering.
Yes, he is, because Billy Joel said it best, only the good die young. And he's still there. I just had a sister who died very recently. And when she was dying, she said, why is our mother still alive? Why is the person who abused us so horribly still alive? And I'm dying. And I'm thinking, great question. Yeah. And it goes back to, I think there is something to that. But yes, he is still alive. And there you are.
Well, first of all, I am so sorry to hear about your sister.
Oh, thank you.
And second of all, I'm surprised nobody has killed him yet.
Yes. Well, Cheryl.
I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like, because he sounds like a really horrible, horrible human being. And I cannot imagine that he has not done some things that might get other people thinking like, maybe this world would be a better place,
It's so funny because as the book was being turned into a movie, I heard that the wonderful Greek actor who played my husband in the movie that is titled differently than my book, Stolen by Their Father. He did not enjoy playing an abusive character at all. It apparently was very troubling to him, but he was so good at it. I was very impressed.
Oh,
So
yeah.
anyway, but no, he's still alive. And I am grateful that I've had no contact with him in many years. And I also like to think that as long as there's time ahead of us, that there is potential for change, or there's potential for even a rough connection. My daughters understand that that is still their father. And if they choose to have contact with them, if one chooses and the other one says no way, everyone celebrates the choices of both. And it's still their dad. And they still may have questions or things that they want to have contact with him about. As of yet, they don't, but they have wonderful relatives in Greece that they still have contact with.
Have they ever gone back to visit them?
They have not, because their father's still alive. I think the moment that that is no longer, and I'm not encouraging any bad behaviors by anyone about this, but I'm just saying, I think that by the time, if there is a time where they're assured safety, that they would go back in a nanosecond. But at this point, it just takes a lot of bandwidth to try to address all the things.
Yeah. Okay. So a little disclaimer here for the audience. We are not advocating for anybody to find this man and eliminate him. But when it does happen, that, then there are other options open for your daughters.
If he passed by natural causes, or if they decide that they don't want to wait and it's best to talk to him, that's fine too. As the kids said not long ago, one of them said, Mom, you're getting pretty old. So imagine how old he is. And so there's not a lot he could do to us, really, when you think about it. I'm like, well, that's a good point.
It is a good point, but there still is that psychological component.
Right.
And I think once you're a psychopath, you're always a psychopath, and that is never going to change. And for somebody to do what he did, even if he has really sincere, heartfelt regret, it's like, forgiveness is one thing, but going back into the lion's den is something else.
I would have to agree 1,000%. And forgiveness doesn't mean that you put yourself in a bad situation. To allow anything to happen again. And I think that's something that's taken me a long time to come to terms with. Is like, just because you forgive someone doesn't mean you invite them to repeat the behaviors.
Right, exactly. Okay, so now let's talk about when did you write the book? When was it published, and when was it picked up as a TV movie, a Lifetime movie? And what was your reaction? I cannot imagine what that was.
That was so exciting. When the kids and I first returned from Alaska, from Greece to Alaska, it was 1996. And not long after that, because of a connection of a dear family friend, we did have our movie rights option. This was well before I had written the book. And I think I got paid $1. And that, as a movie gets optioned, as your story gets optioned, you don't necessarily get any money. You have to have, and I would encourage anyone who's thinking about it, if they've written a book, to get some representation to protect their rights. And it was a great producer. So it's too bad, because they were fabulous, but I love the producer that eventually picked it up. Love them. I have no regrets for how things shook out. So anyway, wonderful producer. They decided to decline after the first year option. I think there'd been a movie made that was very similar from their company. So they're like, no, we're not going to renew it again. So that's okay. It took me decades to write my book. And part of that was I didn't even understand what the real story was. It took a long time for me to realize that journalism writing does not help you write a book.
No.
In fact, it absolutely is counterintuitive for writing a memoir. So it took me a long time, but eventually at the end of 2016, my book was published by a small indie publisher called She Writes Press. And I was pleased with it. And I am very fortunate in some ways in that, this will sound terrible, but it was a dramatic story, and people love dramatic stories, especially true crime type stories. And because it happened in Alaska, there was still old archival news footage that was available. And so for Alaskans, hearing that this story was going to be in a book, some people started getting really excited, saying, I remember where I was when we first heard about this. I remember where I was when her kids came back. So it created locally some book buzz, which was delightful. And then I learned, and I really had to hustle to just make the most of every single opportunity. And I bring this up not to toot my own horn, but to say that every single event I did, I kept on my website and I started putting things on social media. It makes authors trackable. Under search engine optimization, those keywords that come from customer online book reviews, those keywords, even from social media and other things that I'd written, it started getting some attention. And so lo and behold, I'd hope to be a bestseller one day and nothing, the first few months, yes, it got some traction, but then, it dips and an author really has to keep working and working and working. So I do book groups, I did presentations on domestic violence, I did a whole lot of things, funded my own book tour across universities around the country by getting a small grant and staying in things like youth hostels. I mean, I was super determined, but very broke. I mean, I did not have a lot of money to spend. I'd already spent anything I had on getting the book out. So then eventually, I kept working my day job and first year passes, it's getting more traction, which is great. It was kind of unusual. Second year, it starts doing a little bit better in the Amazon rankings. And then I took time and just went on a trip. I needed a break. And I went on what I have learned to do as an older woman is go on solo budget travel trips across the globe. Not for long because I'm not wealthy, but I mean, I stay hardcore cheap. So I was in South America and I got this great email, but I thought, it's probably from a spammer or a scammer. Hey, has your book been optioned to a movie yet? And I'm thinking, oh boy, here's another one of those weird emails. But later I was with a writer friend who lives in Uruguay and she and I Googled it and we're like, oh wait, this is a real company. And it's a nice company. It's a Canadian small production company. And so it was Cineflix. So I thought, well, I'll write them back when I'll just let them know I'm not at home, but when I get home, we'll talk. And I will be darned, it took a year of conversations. My publisher joined in, because I had a publisher that we would split the fee. We eventually got a cinema agent, a film agent on board. And about a year after that, I think it was 2019, signed rights. And when someone options their movie rights, it's just a company has decided to rent their story for a certain amount of time. Most often, nothing happens. About 80% of the time, zero happens. Sometimes people option your rights so they can kill the opportunity for your book to become a movie because there's something similar about to come out. They don't want that to happen.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
So I didn't assume this was, and I had the nicest company, this Canadian company, the producer, Jeff Vanderwall, the most honest and transparent and decent person. And so he'd read the book repeatedly. He could quote the book to me. And that was shocking. Like this intern had Google searched certain terms that came up in the Amazon atmosphere and the keywords, and then passed it off to him when she liked the book. And he loved it and read it repeatedly.
Wow.
So he was a very sincere person. And so first year came and went, we'd talk a couple times that year, but nothing. I didn't expect anything more, but they optioned it a second time. Then lo and behold, the pandemic comes and I think, well, there is the end of that. But how lucky was I to meet nice people? And this will probably never happen. And I will be darned. I moved to Chattanooga just under a year ago. And the movie went in production in November of 2021.
Wow.
Even though there was a pandemic, even though it was a rough time to be producing, they went to Greece.
Wow.
And yes, that shocked me. And they did a great job. And they filmed in Canada for Alaska parts. And they're so good about their COVID restrictions. They didn't want anyone else coming and contaminating, frankly, the set. So the bad news for me was I didn't get to go meet the actors. But the good news was they made a movie and they did a beautiful job that Lifetime eventually picked up. It's not a guarantee once a production company does all of the things that somebody wants it, but I will be darned, Lifetime picked it up and took the reins, a couple of months before the movie came out. And they chose March 5th, just on a whim of 2022 to release the movie. And I mean, it was shocking because that was the anniversary date of me leaving my husband and my whole life changing. And they didn't, Lifetime didn't know that. And they just chose that date. And I happened to be having a trip with my daughter. I wasn't even around for it to be released, but it was so poignant and so lovely for all of us to think you can have one of those anniversary dates that's hurtful, but then something else can come and dilute the impact. So when I think of March 5th from here on out, I will think that's the date that Stolen by Their Father was released instead of that was the anniversary.
Here we go.
Yes.
Because anniversaries are hard.
They are.
There, you think that, oh, but it really just kind of rips at your heart.
It was a wonderful, and I'm not going to say a replacement, but it was a wonderful thing to add to March 5th. I love that they chose that date. I actually kind of loved not being around to see it. I didn't see the movie for 2 weeks after it was released, but it was released on Lifetime. Now it comes on Lifetime Movie Network, and it's always rentable very cheaply on Amazon Prime. A person has to search out the title, but it's very inexpensive. I think they did a beautiful job. I am not kidding. I didn't know what to expect, and I was just amazed that they did a well-rounded job that wasn't just a big tragedy, but it was a lovely, lovely testimony to the beautiful people that helped.
Tell us again what the title of the film is, so our audience, I mean, this will be in the show notes, of course, but I want you to tell them again.
Sure. It's called Stolen by Their Father. And the actress who portrays me is the wonderful Sarah Drew. And she is someone, if people like Grey's Anatomy or many other movies, she's just fabulous. And I think she just nailed the part. Lifetime chose 2 sisters to play my daughters.
Oh,
that was another very touching flourish. And the little girls reached out to my daughters via social media, and they had it was so precious because my kids, now they're grown women and they weren't sure what to expect. And boy, did their hearts open to this process when those girls included them.
Oh, wow.
It was lovely.
What was it like watching the movie for the first time? Were you with your girls when you did it? And was it surreal going, did that really happen to us? Or this is, like watching a movie, it's like, okay, it is somebody else, but you realize that's my life story.
Right. And it's such a good question, Cheryl, because I still have some of the negative side effects from going through what I did. And part of it was I learned to be very distant from my own life and be very detached because that's the only way I could survive all of the things that had happened. But that didn't all go away necessarily with therapy and healing. So it is weird. I watched it at an Airbnb with my oldest daughter. We just finished her very, very belated college graduation trip. So we came back into the States and we watched it at the Airbnb. She'd never read my book. And I don't think she ever will, probably until I die, or maybe even then. It just was so hard on her. All of it, especially with the oldest child in a family, all oldest children experience, they're the sponge of the family. And their experience is very difficult if the family has a lot of dysfunction. So for her, had been too much to read the book. And so we watched the movie together. And so I felt my stomach squeezing thinking about her watching it. But I loved the movie. It started out at a place that was very suspenseful, and then they ended with a very suspenseful place. And it scared me all over again. And I just thought they did a great job. The producer had asked what were important things to me, and I just did not want this to seem like a simplistic, I was a victim and an angel, and my husband was a devil and the offender, and everyone else was either bad or good. Life isn't like that. And I think they gave the movie such dimension. And there were places where they filmed where it actually happened. And it was, it was exciting. But to watch it again, I liked it even more. I sometimes substitute teach here in Chattanooga, and one of the other teachers had us watch it together. A high school class, we all sat and watched it together, and it was like screening it for the first time in a crowd. And that was very emotional, but I loved it. I thought they did a great job, and I just couldn't be more honored by the job they did.
So that would be, I think, again, talk about surreal, that you're watching this movie in a group there at the school, and were people looking at you like,
Yes, I know. Even I was like kind of emotional. I'd not been emotional before, but I was like, oh, that's so sad. This poor mother. And it was me.
Okay, I'm
Sorry,
sorry, that's
go.
so funny, but I mean, it makes so much sense. It's like,
Right,
yeah, a lot of times, you look back and go, "Was that really me that this happened
right.
to?" Oh,
Exactly.
that's so funny. Okay, so let's segue into something that really isn't very funny, because
Right.
you did mention, when your sister was dying, that, you referred to your mom. So apparently you did grow up
Right.
in an abusive home.
Not only that, we had suffered a separation from our respective fathers through a parental child abduction. So our lives began with those separations. And I remember as a young child, me thinking, I'm going to be an amazing parent because I was very self righteous as soon as I could speak. I thought, I'll never divorce. My kids will not have to go through separation. There
Mm,
won't be people finding their father through a lawyer like I had to do.
mm,
And I'm going to be great as a parent, and this is going to be I'm going to nail this thing that my parents had struggled with, and then sure enough ended up replicating their behaviors. My mom, I am sure, and she still is alive as we at least tape, but my mom, I think, had mental health problems, but also personality disorders. And
mm,
I think you can forgive almost anything in life as long as a person is willing to come clean and address the behaviors
mhm,
and not be
mhm,
perfect in fixing it, but address the
mhm,
behaviors. And unfortunately, for my oldest sister, she really suffered so much. And I never quite understood the extent of her suffering because she's 10 years older than me. And so
mhm.
it wasn't until we all got on a group text thread, I didn't meet my final sibling on my mom's side until I was in my 50s doing a book event in Kentucky. And my final brother I'd never met came to the book event. The suffering that happened due to the separation between siblings, due to the secrets we were forced to keep, due to abuse by certainly our mother. And, there were some input by fathers that weren't always productive at all. And certainly my dad was
Mhm.
later, I explained in the book, he was very honest about being guilty of domestic violence and talked about how sorry he was and how damaging that had been to his children. So, my sister was the oldest child in the family, and it wasn't until she was dying that I understood she felt the weight, just like my daughter did. She felt the weight of responsibility to protect us kids. And
Mhm.
she was just a little girl when we all got divided. She didn't want us to be divided. We never saw our brother. We've never been in a room together, and we never will be again with all the siblings because now one of us has died. And it was her greatest dream that we would all be back together one day. And she said that in a text thread.
Mhm.
And for her that would never happen in person. What she doesn't realize maybe is that because of her, it sort of did happen
Mhm.
due to the text threads. It
Mhm.
caused us all of us who were able, we have one brother who's now nonverbal, but all of us were able to rally around her and be
Mhm.
together. Maybe not physically,
Mhm.
but we were able to be together. So, it was a very sad thing, but she did bring up the fact. And I thought it was very brave of her to say, why? Why am I dying?
Yeah.
And our mother could outlive us. That's
Mhm.
so unfair. And yet,
Mhm.
she's not suffering anymore. And she made a huge impact on her world. And she made a greater impact on us siblings that I never known
Mhm.
until we all got to know each other better.
So as far as the siblings, and there was the older sister that passed away, there's you and a brother. Is it just the two of you now, or are there more?
Nope. On my mom's side, there are a number of kids. On my dad's side, there are a number of kids. So on my mom's side, there was my oldest sister, Wanda. There were two brothers, another sister and another sister, and then me. So my mother had six children. My
Wow.
father also had six children. And
Wow.
in the middle, I'm the intersection. So that means that I have 11 brothers and sisters.
Holy moly.
Yes. But you know
So,
what? That's maybe the best part of the story, is
yeah.
like getting to meet them later in life and it's not all happily ever after. It's not like we're all super, super close, or, we have different baggage that we each carry, but it's still a wonderful group to be related to, a wonderful group to know, and strong, smart, amazing people who are survivors.
So basically, in spite of all the parental dysfunction, they were
Yeah.
still able to reproduce. So I guess
Yeah.
that's good.
Right. And there were some good things that happened with parents too. And I think that's the
Yeah.
hard thing about writing a book or a book
Yeah.
becoming a movie. Even my mom did some things that were great, and certainly our respective fathers did. But when you're boiling it all down to hold the interest in a
Right.
90-minute movie, you don't
Right.
see any of that necessarily. But everyone has their strengths and the other things that we inherited, and we all deal with it differently.
So now you're talking about Alaska. I know that's where you're from. Were you born
Right.
and raised there?
I was born in Kentucky. And
Oh,
then when my mother needed to go missing, she took some of her children, and we went, I think, first to Louisiana. I don't remember it, but I've heard this. And then eventually to Alaska. And she left some of her other kids behind. And then she started scattering the others, or, booting them out of the house. So that's how I ended up in Alaska. A lot of people go to Alaska because back in the day, maybe not as much now, but back in the day, you either went to pursue gold or be in the oil industry, or perhaps you've gotten into legal trouble and you fled to Alaska. And that still happens. I worked 20 years in probation there. That's still a thing. But that's how I got to Alaska. Alaska was like my parent in a sense, but Kentucky was my home of origin. And now I've chosen to live in Tennessee, very close to Kentucky.
And what made you decide to leave Alaska, and why did you choose Chattanooga? I think it has just a really cool name. I'd pick it just on the name itself.
I know. Think about Chattanooga Choo Choo.
That's exactly what I'm thinking of.
I know. I had originally thought that I'd have the luxury of time when I retired from government work, and maybe I could rent a place. This is pie in the sky because I'm not a wealthy person to be able to do this, but that I'd rent a place for a few months in one city and then come back home. And the next year I'd go to a different city in the wintertime and come back home. And after a few years, I'd select a place to live. But as life happens, the pandemic came, and I was working through the pandemic and retired during the pandemic. There wasn't the option to just travel easily or move easily. And I thought, I'll just outwait the pandemic and not even worry about it. And then we had a horrifying snowstorm. It wasn't our first, but I had already paid off my little condo or my little townhouse and felt like financial security should be mine. And one day woke up with water dripping on my forehead. And this was again in March. And I was like, you know what? I can't outwait the pandemic. I can't do this. This was the third time I had roof problems. I had heard years before from someone that Alaska and Chattanooga were similar. I wanted to be closer to my family, but have some parts of Alaska. I love cultural diversity, university towns. I love water, and I love, good medical is always important. And so art community, very important. I wanted an artsy community. Alaska is very artsy. And a woman I didn't know very well said, Chattanooga ticks all those boxes. You should visit Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so the day in March when we had the snowstorm, I didn't get to visit Chattanooga. I just said, I'm going there to rent a place. That's what's happening. This is it. This is the end. And so a couple months later, I came to Chattanooga, and my sister from Kentucky on my dad's side generously came, and we looked for apartments, got on a wait list, and here I am. I've been here almost a year, and it was scary. I moved away from my daughters who were in their 30s. I brought my cats. I knew no one. I had no friends, no family in Chattanooga, no job, and just thought, I'll see what I'm made of, but I've got to have a change while I still have my original teeth and hips. So there we are.
And I know you brought the cats because one of them a while back just kind of walked across. He's such a pretty little thing.
Thank you. He likes that to be registered. So anytime I'm doing a video, he's like, I hope people know how good looking I am. So he walks behind me.
Well, he walks slowly enough so people really can admire his beauty. And if they don't notice at first, he takes his time walking.
He'll come back around, I'm sure. He does not want to be missed.
So basically, one of the things that you said that just kind of cracked me up when you said, "Oh, well, I'm not a wealthy person." So are you implying that writing a book and having that book turned into a movie does not necessarily imply wealth?
It does not imply wealth. It does not imply book sales necessarily, not a whole bunch, because people don't read as much as they used to, and my movie title is different than my book title. I think people have a lot of thoughts about what it would be like, and they're very grandiose thoughts. I was paid a very fair wage for these things. I checked, and I know that our film agent did be proud, but I had to split it in half with my publisher.
Mhm.
It was more than I would have ever made selling books on my own, certainly. But I could not pay for my used car entirely with what I got paid.
Mhm.
So just my used car that I bought in COVID when the prices were inflated. So it's just something to keep
Mhm.
in mind. It doesn't make you wealthy. It doesn't even necessarily. I've talked to other authors who said they didn't notice any change in book sales. And occasionally, like right now, we have Where the Crawdads Sing. That movie was the same title as the book, and the book was a huge hit. And it's only made the book more popular, and that's wonderful. So those things do happen, but
Mhm.
it's not by any means an automatic given.
Mhm. So it didn't make you wealthy. Did it make you famous?
I don't think it made me famous, but what it has done, first of all, it did pay, like I said, more than I would have had before. It was a rewarding experience. It is a constant source
Mhm.
of, and I don't mean constant everyday scary source. Like if it plays on Lifetime, I get right. I have a number of people reach out to me on my website. That always happens. A lot
Mhm.
of times they're in active crisis and it may be
Mhm.
something they think I can fix. Uh, Sometimes I have met with people if they seem like there's something I could help with, sometimes not if I know they need a different referral than I can offer, but it
Mhm.
offers connection that way.
Mhm.
And it certainly offers the potential for making those connections and making a difference. And so I do love it. I cannot say enough. I don't
Mhm.
have bad things to say about it. It was imperfect. That's just how life is. So right before the
Mhm.
movie comes out, my publishers knew it was coming out. They didn't notice that my book had run out of print.
Oh.
Normally, they were all over that months before it would run out of print. They were like, hey, you're getting low on inventory. We need to talk about X, Y, or Z. Nope, didn't notice it. It ran out. I wasn't there for when the movie came out. So for 2 months, you couldn't get a hard copy. So that was heartbreaking, but it's life. It's just how life is. It's not perfect. It's
Yeah.
fine. Book is available on audio, digital, and now paperback again. And you know what? Just the connections and the neat
Mhm.
response. And I think it helps people who feel like there's no hope for their future. As long as we're living, there's hope for their future. And for parents who've thought that they're in a custody situation, what would happen if we break up? It asks some questions of them to look deeper.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's something parents do need to know as moms and dads. You need to know that just because maybe you never married, that doesn't make an advantage for you whatsoever in the realm of custody. There needs to be a custody order. And there are things people can do if they're concerned that their child might be kidnapped by a former partner or spouse.
Mhm.
And there are wonderful ways to co-parent
Mhm.
to make it child-centered and
Mhm.
prevent abductions. I think one of the best parts of writing a book for me was hearing from a couple of parents who wrote and said very explicitly, I was thinking about taking my child out of country because I'm so sick of dealing with the courts, but hearing about the long-term damage that happened to your daughters, I
Mhm.
won't. I
Mhm.
think sometimes we forget in the middle of love and breakups that children are not they should never be collateral damage. They're not
Mhm.
pawns. They're not tools to weaponize. And so, it's a good opportunity to remind people, let's be careful, let's have custody orders in place, let's be respectful, and let's be cautious.
So if somebody is listening to this show right now and they're in that situation where they're either concerned that an abduction might happen with one of the parents, or that their child is in jeopardy, or they're thinking of wanting to split up, but they're concerned about that, what advice would you give to parents or even somebody who knows a friend or family member who might be going through something like this, what would you advise them to do? Because I know there are a lot of resources out there, but I think when people are right in the throes of either, conflict or almost a pending crisis situation, they can't think straight.
Right. Exactly right. And whatever someone tells you on the phone, you're not going to remember when you get off the phone if you're in that kind of a crisis. And I totally understand that. And so contacting experts, if a person lives in the United States, and even if they don't, Googling, putting in their search engine, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and or Child Find. And there are a number of other agencies, missing children's agencies. I would say the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has free handouts that they mail to people on how to prevent an abduction, the things to get in order in case you believe this may be a potential problem. I was very fortunate when my kids were kidnapped, not because they were kidnapped, but because I got to be a part of a long-term study on how to prevent international parental abductions. And I met with other parents whose kids were taken all over the world. We met in Washington, D.C., but the outcomes then informed some of these things that I'm telling you about, the prevention measures, knowing the signs of perhaps when an abduction is going to occur. The other part of that, sometimes parental abductions occur very, very often in the context of an abusive relationship. It's important for people to not have a lot of ego about their situation, but if you're in an abusive relationship where you feel like you're being controlled or manipulated or threatened by a partner, that your behaviors are being curbed by someone else, to get that help through abuse agency and really address that. It's very important not to go through these horrible times, sometimes that happen in life alone. You need to not just rely on your family or your church or one person who you think might rescue you from this. It's important to really get involved with a group who has expertise and who also can help you understand yourself more and advocate for yourself better and be in this shape to be able to fight the good fight. I don't mean physical fighting. I mean the challenges that life is perhaps about to deal. So I'd really say I see a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of young women and sometimes young men who will say, I know I'm going through this thing, but I know I can manage it alone. I'm mentally strong. And I'm like, no, actually, that's not how this goes. You really, really, really need to get rid of the idea that it's somehow a sign of strength to deal with things on your own or to only rely on people you know. It's learning in peer support groups often that teaches you the best information.
Absolutely. So this kind of segues very nicely into the next question I have for you, or the next topic I wanted you to address, because another book that you wrote is titled When Push Comes to Shove. So tell us about that book and how people can get a lot of valuable information, just like you were talking about, out of this book.
Well, and I thank you. It is a very small book, so I just want people to know it's a very tiny little book. It's a guide really about the things that I learned. I'm going to have to update that book at some point, but because I think some of the jargon we use is different today. We use terms today like love bombing, and a lot of times people call abusers narcissists, and that's not actually accurate. That's a mental health term that one does not necessarily mean the other, but people use it anyway. When Push Comes to Shove really was born out of my work with survivors of domestic abuse and their families. When I first became a domestic violence advocate, which was a job I loved and did for many years, often parents or neighbors or concerned people would call our agency, especially after the Nicole Brown Simpson homicide that was very famous in the 90s. And they'd say, what can I do? I know my friend has signs of being abused. What can I do to make a difference? And we would have this terrible answer, which was, why don't you go to a codependency no more group? Terrible answer, but we didn't know what to say. And it's hard to know what to say. And so really this guide is to help you understand that the dynamics of abuse, and that if leaving abuse is not a one-time event, but it's a process that may take several tries, then getting out of abuse permanently is also a journey. And we can't have people trying to live that journey for their friend, because it's very easy when you're in an abusive relationship, you often will want to abdicate authority of your life. You want to hand over the reins and say, oh, friend, you said you could help me and you would take over. Please do.
Please, yeah.
Let me know when it's over. And people who do that kind of thing, or who get in that next relationship, hoping that relationship is going to rescue them, a decade later, they're feeling betrayed. Their life is still not their own. They're still under someone else's thumb. There's not an easy cliff notes to becoming a survivor that lives a life that they're proud of. And so really, I want people to understand that there are ways that we can support survivors of domestic violence, and there are ways to be avoided. And so that's where that was born from. My next book is called Grounded in Grit, and it's not out yet, but it is also a lot. It's much more for survivors, but helping people understand the difference between abdicating authority in our lives versus delegating certain things and getting support. And I think those are really important distinctions to make, because if we continually abdicate authority to someone else, we're just going to be disappointed and find ourselves under the control of either, quite frankly, an organized religion sometimes, and not that religion is bad or that churches are bad, but if you're not careful, you're abdicating. That's what I'm saying. You're abdicating. I want people to understand you can learn about how you ended up in the situation that sometimes we end up in, and grow from that and turn that into your superpower.
So now tell us the title of that book again. That
will be Grounded in Grit, and the subtitle may change a little bit, but it's turning your challenges into your superpowers. That's where it is right now. And that doesn't come easily. It's not like something that's like, hey, just take this class and you will be just fine. No. There is a process to it. But once embraced, it is so exciting what life has ahead. It's not just trauma to drama.
Right.
There are many cool things we can choose when we learn to deal with some of these very, very big challenges life throws at us.
Do you have any idea when it'll be out?
I am very hopeful that it will happen in the new part of 2023. The editor has it second time around. But I will let you know when I learn more about the exact date. So I'm excited.
That's very exciting. You also wrote a book titled A Girl's Guide to Traveling Alone. If you want to touch on that just briefly, that'd be great.
And I'm so glad you brought that up. Thank you, Cheryl. I am a contributor to A Girl's Guide to Traveling Alone. And for your listeners who think about writing, one of the best things I feel like you can do before you take on a manuscript, a book-sized book, right, is to be in an anthology. And one of the things that I learned about myself when my kids were grown and I was in my early 40s when they were both young adults, was I still needed some excitement in my life. It just didn't need to be horror and drama, but I needed to have some challenges. So I started traveling the globe on a shoestring budget by myself. And so I wrote a little essay that got into this anthology of other women solo travelers. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that your listeners all want to be a solo traveler or that that's safe at all points. It's not necessarily. It depends on how you do it. But for me, it helped me so much realize you don't wait in life for somebody to give you permission to live your dreams. Solo travel isn't just for the couple. It's not just for the wealthy. It's not just for young kids who can put on a backpack and stay in a hostel. Here I was in middle-aged with the young kids in a hostel. Being that creepy older person, it's like, hey, grandma, what you doing? So I literally was able to, before the pandemic, hit 6 of the 7 continents. Wow. And so now with one more, then I have a memoir called A Different Dundee. And then the subtitle will be different, but it is about being a clumsy, older, not wealthy person traveling the globe.
Oh, you have to keep me informed about that book. That's so just awesome.
Enjoying it because it's not just for solo travelers. It's greenlighting our dreams, whatever they may be. It's not waiting for someone to say, hey, you've always thought quietly about this thing. You should wait for someone else to make it possible for you. No, it's about you deciding, oh, I think it's time.
Okay. I have a story about a solo traveler, and that is a good friend of mine. She's actually my publishing consultant, and she is the first woman to walk around the world, and she really did it.
I
It's
love that.
incredible. Her book is titled 3MPH. The author's name is Polly Latovsky. So, okay, Polly, if you're listening to this, and I know you are, I'm giving you a plug. Yeah, it's amazing. It's an incredible story. And as she was doing it for breast cancer awareness, especially in third world countries where they didn't have the screenings, and in certain other countries where the women would rather die than to expose their breasts to a physician to be evaluated, you know.
Oh my
So,
goodness.
I mean, that was basically her mission. And halfway through was when 9/11 happened. So it's a fantastic book. You will laugh, you will cry. She takes you on an incredible journey. And when you meet her in person, it's like, really? You did that? Really, Nancy? Really? Okay, well, whatever. Yeah, I believe you.
I love that. I love that so much, because I think often, and I know that men go through this too for different reasons, but for women, we are really conditioned to put everyone else ahead of ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
And to take the temperature of the room to make sure everyone else is okay before we feel like we can sit calmly and be fine with that. And, you know, everyone else is fed, entertained, happy, good moods, all of that. And then what's left? I just spoke to a teacher the other day who had raised her fourth child, and she painted a picture on a canvas, and her husband said to her, I didn't know you liked painting. And she was furious. And it just all came burbling to the top for her. But it was like, of course you didn't, because I have been taking care of you and 4 other people and putting everything else I wanted to the side for all these decades. And now I will be painting. Thank you very much. And she didn't mean to be mad at him, but it's something that we don't have to do to ourselves. We can add more balance in our life, and we don't have to wait till our kids are fully grown to gather some of that. You know, no one is really asking, hopefully no one's asking that of us anymore in this decade, but we're still a lot of times shrinking to fit the expectations of a gender where that expectation doesn't fit anymore. And so solo travel for me was like the first green light I gave myself. Next came writing, and it just has mushroomed.
It's another creative and artistic release.
It is. It so is. It is not for everyone, but I just love to challenge people. What is then your dream? What is it that you're going to be going for?
Yeah. And the writing really, it's not for everybody, and it's not for the faint of heart. I will tell you that as well.
Exactly. And it's not going to make you millions necessarily, although there are those one-offs. So
yeah, highlight that. Okay. I just wanted to bring up before we wrap up that there is a movie out there, the one first production company that was thinking about yours and then turned it down. I just can't help but wonder if the movie that they had that was similar to yours was the titled Not Without My Daughter.
No, that movie, good question. I loved that movie. It's still spooky. But
yeah, it gave me nightmares. I mean, and it's still, I saw it, it's over 20 years and it's still.
Oh, it's way over 20 years. I'm going to say it came out in 1989.
Wow.
So if I'm not mistaken, that came out in the late 80s, and even the movie did, because I remember being married and seeing that on the marquee, and just, I don't know, it was just terrifying. But that author, Betty Mahmoudi, she had an agency that helped during my process. In fact, she was the one who connected me to the study on international parental child abductions, and I was very fortunate. It was not that. They did a different movie, and it was a Greek setting. I can't remember the movie exactly, but I do know that Tyne Daly was a star, and it was a fabulous movie. And it was basically on a bitter Greek mother-in-law trying to kill her daughter-in-law. And it was like I said, it was a true story. It was fabulous. It was so good. But I love, you know, life takes us where we need to go. And I am thrilled with the production company that I ended up with at Cineflix. And then they, you know, the first one was going to make it a Lifetime movie anyway in the 90s. And then it ends up being a Lifetime movie all these years later. So you end up on the path you need to be on, I guess.
I guess. And the other thing I did want to bring up too, and this is mostly for the audience, when you were talking about like, domestic abuse and the signs
Right.
and all that kind of stuff, and even at the toward the very beginning of the show, that there is a book that I absolutely love. As a matter of fact, it is right here on the table beside me because I still go through it,
Oh,
when I'm waiting for people to either sign on or whatever. And that is The Gift of Fear by
mm,
Gavin DeBecker. And somebody had told me about this book. Oh my gosh, it was right at the very beginning of my martial arts training. So it was probably 20 years ago. The book's been out a very long time. And Gavin DeBecker is actually a security and safety, there's another cat, safety and security expert. And so he really helps highlight the signs and the symptoms and what to look for. It is not an easy book to read. And I will tell
right.
you that, right off the bat, but I do believe that everyone should read that book because it is really, it's frightening, but it's enlightening. And you do actually feel very empowered,
I
once you
love
do.
it.
Yeah.
I love that. And I feel like if we could front load our kids growing up with, first of all, as much self-esteem and as much information on how to pick good friends
Mm-hmm.
and later good partners, how to
Mm-hmm.
spot bullying, because those are similar, well, same topic. And I think one of the most important things is to have a strong sense of self and know
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, know that we have a way out of relationships when we get old enough to date, that
Mm-hmm.
we have some financial independence, that we have a way to make money when if we choose to get married or couple in that way, that
Mm-hmm.
if we had to, if something ended that relationship, whatever it may be,
Mm-hmm.
that we could land on our feet. That is so
Mm-hmm.
important rather than early marriages, in education, and
Mm-hmm.
dependency. I think
Mm-hmm.
anytime someone wants to foster dependency on themselves, run as fast as you can.
Mm-hmm. Excellent advice. I was going to ask you to leave us with some, final tips. I would say that would be it. So
Thank
thank you.
you.
But if you have anything else that you want to, any final pearls of wisdom that you want to drop on the audience, now is the time.
I have sure loved being with you so much,
Ah,
Cheryl. I really appreciate it. And I would say the other part of that is whether it's parenting or whether it's an intimate relationship, anytime someone wants you to be isolated or wants to set you up and pit you against another person, if they feel more secure cutting you away from your interests and other people, that is a toxic relationship, and you must find a way to break out of isolation. And
mhm,
I even see this, and this is one reason why I never reunited with my mother, who is still alive. She really has fostered resentments between her kids later in life before she lost contact with all of them, and always wanted us to be divided. And that's the
mhm.
sign of somebody who, that's just not good parenting. You don't want
Yeah,
parents who pick favorites or
yeah.
pick sides, or, when my kids argue, even though they're in their 30s and they can be dramatic, they're
Oh,
Greek
yes.
after all. But if one calls me, I always remind them, I'm not team you. I am team the two of you getting along. And you are too old to be calling me to put me in the middle of it, but also I am team you two being the best sister to each other. So, you just want people who support you being at your
Mhm.
strongest, not at your weakest.
They are so lucky to have you as a mom.
Thank you. Not always, but thank you.
Okay. And now, where can the audience find you?
Oh, I have a website at lameredith.com, or I'm on Persistence You podcast with Lizbeth, and every Friday I do Facebook Lives.
Ooh,
Yes, just little
okay.
check-ins. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Cheryl. I loved being with you, just like I loved having you on my show.
Oh, thank you. You are so much fun to talk to, Elizabeth. And I tell you, you are such an inspiration. I do believe that you are probably one of the most courageous women I have ever met.
Oh, thank you. Thank you
And
so much.
to do what you have done and then to spread the word, to put yourself out there, that's not an easy thing to do.
Thank you. Well, I could not have done anything alone. That's the main thing. So makes sense to want to pay it forward later, because there were a whole lot of people I've been indebted to. And now
Hmm.
I have wonderful family connections and things. And I know if something happened today, they'd be there in a heartbeat. But when
Hmm.
I didn't have it, all kinds of people showed up.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. That warms my heart, and it gives me a lot more faith in humanity. So I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you.
And everybody, thank you so much for listening. Oh my gosh, what a story. Really, check out Lizbeth's podcast, check out her website, check out her books, and watch her movie. I know that's going to be on my list of things to do. What a wonderful woman, an incredible story, and wonderful tips. And please do remember to take care of yourself. Look for those signs, act on them, ask for help if you need it, because life is way too short, and you want to be able to take care of not only yourself, but the people you love, and to be safe and healthy for the rest of your lives. And that is the
Absolutely.
way of the FemiNinja.